Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to a new Envato Tuts Plus course. My name is Purdila, and in today's video, you'll learn how to create a simple yet functional weather app using vanilla JavaScript and the Open Weather API. This is the final product, and to get going, all you have to do is type a city name and hit enter. There's an AJAX request being performed, and if that's successful, then we display weather information for that particular city. Simple. Now, if you've never done this kind of thing before, don't worry, it's not that complicated, and I'll explain everything in as much detail as possible. Here's how we'll build this app. First, we'll write some HTML to define the structure of our page. Then we'll style it by writing CSS code. And finally, we'll make everything functional by using vanilla JavaScript and the Open Weather API. So, pretty straightforward. This is not a very advanced app, but you'll certainly understand the code a lot faster if you already know a bit of CSS and JavaScript. Now, before we get started, I would like to thank the sponsor of today's video, which is Envato Elements. Here you can find tons of useful resources like fonts, icons, UI kits, WordPress themes, music, stock photos, and much more. For creatives like me, this is an awesome resource because all the assets have simple commercial licensing and you're not bound to any contract. Therefore, you can cancel whenever you want. So if you're interested, check out the link in the video description. All right, let's get the show on the road, and the first thing we'll do is create the structure of the weather app. Before we get started, I would just like to mention that this course is based on a tutorial written by Mr. George Martsukos, and you'll find links to the original tutorial in the video description, and there you'll also find links to any other resource that I used. If you want to follow along with the code that I'm writing, I included a starter kit so you can get the exact code that I'll be starting with for this course. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to Envato Tuts Plus for more free courses and tutorials just like this one. All right, let's write some markup. Now, we'll be creating our weather app based on this design that I made. This, in turn, is based on the original app that George built, and I just made a few changes here and there. But essentially, this is what it looks like on mobile. We have these cards that show the different cities and the weather conditions. And then on larger screens, those cards are now displayed in kind of this vertical fashion with the icon on top, the temperature down below, a description of the weather conditions, and then the name of the city and the country code. Okay, so this is actually what we need to create. Now, if you want to create this yourself and you don't want to use this design, which by the way, you will find in the video description, you'll find a link to download this exact design file. But if you want to use a different one and you don't know where to start, then you can head over to Envato Elements. You can search for example, weather, and you'll find a bunch of related assets like, for example, icons and illustrations, right? So if you go to graphics here, you'll find a bunch of weather-related icons, which you can download. Or if you're looking for maybe a UI kit, you can go to graphic templates, and you'll find a lot of UI kits for weather apps, and you can use one of these. The choice really is up to you. Me personally, I'm just going to use this weather icon set from Envato Elements. It's called Weather Icons and Fonts, and you'll also find a link to that in the video description. All right, now based on this design, let's go ahead and create the markup or the HTML code. Okay, so I'm going to close these, and I'm going to jump back here in the browser, and I already created a folder here, and let me just put these side by side. The folder that you can also start with if you download the starter kit contains an index.html that currently just has some starting code. You have an app.js, which is blank, an app.css, which contains just a few styles, mostly just general styling and some typography styles. And then we have a couple of images. We have an SVG for the button. We have a search icon for the search field. And then we have a bunch of weather icons that are taken from the icon set that I just showed you. So this is what we have to start with. Let's go in the index.html. And here I'm just loading a reset file to kick things off. I'm using modern normalize. I'm loading the fig tree Google font, and I'm also loading the main CSS. And in here, I have a div class notification that's responsible for displaying this element here on the top, right? That just says, hey, the demo needs an open weather API key. And you can get yours if you go to this link right here. I'm going to be using the same key that George used in his tutorial, but I recommend if you want to follow along, getting your own key. So with that said, let's get started. So let's take a quick look at what we have to work with here. So we basically have a title and then the form, which also has this message box that displays, various error statuses and so on. And then we have the list of cities and a simple footer. So let's start with a header element. And actually, I'm going to start with a container. And in here, I'm going to have a header, an H1 that says add location. And then we'll have our form. Let's give this an ID of search form. We can leave the action blank. It doesn't really matter. And then we'll create a label for search term. And the label will say search the city or area. And then let's create the contents of the form. So we just have an input and a button, basically. And then this message box. So let's say div class, we'll give it a class of form row. And then we'll create an input type text. Let's give this a placeholder like so. And let's give this a name, search term. Let's also give this an ID of search term. So it's now linked with the label. And also let's set autofocus on it because I want this to have focus every time I refresh the page, just like this. Great. Let's actually bring this back to 0. And then under the input, I'm just going to have a button, type submit, and the button is just going to have an image inside the SVG that I just showed you. So that's going to be image / plus circle, and we'll set the alt to plus circle. So far, that looks something like this. And then under the form row, we'll just create a paragraph with the class of form MSG, the form message. Okay, and that's about it for the header. Next, still inside the container, because we're going to use the container to set a max width for our content, and also to center everything nicely in the page, just like you can see here in the version for the bigger screens. So for the cities, we'll create a section and a UL class cities, and let's put that on hold for now. And let's go ahead and create the footer. And in here, I'm just going to use a paragraph and a small tag, and I'm going to put the text content that you saw here with links to my website and George's website. All right, now let's see about the list of cities. Let's take a look at the structure. So in here, we have an icon. We have the temperature, a description, city, and country code. So the markup would look something like this. We create a list item, of course. Each city card will be represented by a list item. And for the icon, we'll use a figure element. And inside, just an image, source img, weather. Let's just use one of the SVGs as a demo. Let's call this demo. By the way, this code, this list item code, will be generated later from JavaScript. For now, we just want to hard code it into the index page so that we can style it properly. Okay, so that's the image. And then for the rest of the content, we'll use a div. And I'm going to use an h2 for the temperature. Let's say 21. And then we'll use superscript to display the degrees, the Celsius degrees. Okay, so that looks something like this so far. Next, let's create a paragraph with the class of city conditions. And we're going to type in sunny. And then let's create an h3 that has two spans inside. So span 1 is going to have the class of city name. So let's say Athens. And the second span will have the class of city country. Let's say GR for Greece. And that's about it. Now what we can do is just copy this list item and let's just duplicate it a couple of times so we can style it properly. And that's it, really. That's the only HTML that we have to write. It's a pretty simple app, as I was saying, so we don't really need to go any further than this. Okay, so the markup, the HTML for our weather app is now complete, but it doesn't look very good because we have very little custom styling applied to it. So let's go ahead and fix that, and let's make this look just a little bit better by writing our own CSS. So let's get straight into it. Let's first write the necessary code for the small screens, right? So I'm just gonna resize this so we have a bit more space to work with here. So let's open the app CSS and let me show you what we have so far. So I defined some custom properties basically for the colors. So we have a global border radius, which we're using, and a global transition. And then for the general styles, I'm just setting some font sizes, font family for the body, and just some resets for the figure. Setting max width and height auto to the image element, and then setting the proper padding of 4 rem and 2 rem for the container, right? So this make sure we have a little bit of padding on the sides of the element here. And then I went ahead and created or added all the correct font sizes for the headings, the paragraphs, and the small elements based on our design, and also some styling for the links, for the anchor tags, setting a color, text decoration none to remove the underline, and then adding a transition. Now, let's start from the top here and work on the forms. So for the forms, let's start with this form. Let's make it as wide as the parent element, like so. And let's add a margin bottom of 2 rems. Let's also set a max width of 30 rems. And this will help us when we get to the bigger screens. We make sure that we don't have a super long form. Now, let's see about that label. Let's set a margin bottom of 0.5 rems. That's about 8 pixels, like that. And also, we'll make sure the display is set to block so it clears a new row, so it's displayed on different rows compared to the actual input. Now, speaking of the input, let's go ahead and style that one next. So what I'm going to do here is just say border radius, and I'm going to set the that to the global variable that we're using. And also let's get rid of the border. So I'm going to set border to 0. Let me actually zoom in here a little bit more so you can see what we're doing. Now let's target the input type text, which is this one, right? And in here, let's set a fixed height. It's going to be 2.75 rems based on the design that we're using. And let's set a background color and a background image, because if you remember from our design, let me actually make this a bit bigger again. If you remember from our design, let me actually hide the UI here. We have an icon applied here to the left, and we have a darker color for the background, right? So to apply that, we're going to say background. We're going to use the shorthand notation here. So for the background color, I'm actually going to use p shade 30, and then the URL is going to be img search.svg, and we're going to place this 0.75 rems from the left. We're going to place it center or to the center vertically, and we're going to set it to no repeat. And let's see, why isn't this working? Input type text. Oh, I forgot one of those. There we go. That's a lot better. So we added the background color, we added the proper padding, we added the image. Let's change the color. I'm going to use p tint 90. And what else? Padding left. We need a little bit of padding left to push that text to the right side. 2.25 rems is going to be here, like so. And let's click this. We have a small outline that that creeps up in there, so let's set outline to none. All right, and let's also style that that placeholder. So we'll say input placeholder, and let's change the color to tint 40, like that. Now, based on our design, the input and the button are sitting in the same row. So let's target that form row div that we created here. And let's use flexbox. So I'm going to say form row. I'm simply going to say display flex. And let's set a gap of 0.5 rems. That's just going to set a small gap between the two elements. Let's also allow this, this input to occupy the entire available space. And because we're using flexbox, I'm just going to say flex grow 1. And that's going to take up the entire available space. Great. Let's quickly add some focus and hover styles for this input, like that. So on focus and hover, I'm simply changing the background color. And let's add a nice transition here. And we're going to use the global transition to make things easier for us. Nice. Now let's take care of the form button, right? So I'm going to say form button. Let's give it the same width and height as our form element. So 2.7 rems, 2.75 rems actually, like that. Let's set a background color. That's the secondary custom property that I defined. Let's get rid of the border. All right. Let's add a border radius. And again, we're going to use the global radius. And let's also position this icon right in the middle of that element. For that, we can simply use flexbox. And I'm going to say align items to the center and also justify content to the center. So now that button is right, or that image, that SVG is right in the middle of the button. Let's also change the cursor to pointer. So we get a nice cursor. And let's also add some hover and active states for the button. And those look something like this. So on hover, we basically change the background color, and on active, we change it again. Let's also set up a transition, like so. Okay, cool. Next, let's see about the form message, right? So the one that we're displaying here. And as you can see, this is displayed below the input, and it's basically a box with rounded corners and a little bit of padding, top, bottom, left, right. So we'll say form message. Let's start by defining the background color. We're going to use P shade 20. Let's set up the padding, and let's also, type in some text. Hello, this is a message. This will be generated from JavaScript, but we need to add it now so we can style it. For the padding, let's do 0.5 rems and 1 rem. So 0.5 top, bottom, 1 rem, left, right, like so. Let's change the border radius. This time, I just want the radius on the bottom left and right corners. So to do that, we're going to say 0, 0, and then global border radius, and again, global border radius. So now, if you can see, it only has rounded corners on the bottom part. What else? Let's push it to the right a little bit. So we'll say margin left. Let's do 0.75 rems, like that. And let's set a width of 75%. Okay, so that looks pretty good. This will be hidden by default, and it's only going to be shown when we need to display an actual message. So what we can do to create this hidden or visible state is to use transforms and opacity. So I can say transform, translate 3D. We can go with 3D, 0, minus 100%, and 0. And this is just going to push it up by its exact height amount. And then we can set the opacity to 0, but I'm going to set this last. And notice this is kind of sitting on top of the input. I want it to sit under it. So I'm going to set the z-index to -1. And also we need to set position relative for that bit to work. Okay, so now the form message is hidden under the input. Let's go ahead and turn on opacity 0 as well. And let's add a transition, global transition. So then form message will create a separate class called visible, which will trigger from JavaScript. Here we'll just say transform, translate 3D, 0, 0, 0. This brings it back to the original position, and we'll set the opacity to 1. And you'll see exactly how this works when we get to the JavaScript part. Okay, so that's about it for the form element. Everything looks good right now. Let's move on to the header, because we need to make some quick adjustments here. So in the header, we'll just write some quick CSS to style this notification part to match this. And that code looks something like this. So I'm just changing the background color, the padding, setting width to 100%, and then the margin of the paragraph is set to 0. Cool. Let's move on to the main part of the app, which is the cities, right? And the cities look something like this on smaller screens. So they're displayed horizontally, but then on larger screens, they're displayed vertically, just like you can see here. But obviously the markup is the same. So we need to use CSS to change the way these look, depending on what size screen we're seeing them. Let's say cities. So cities is the UL. It's the unordered list, so the parent element. We're going to be using CSS grid. So we're going to set display grid. And of course, by default, this is just displayed in one column. Let's start by setting padding 0. List style, we can set to none to get rid of the bullet points. Let's also add a bottom margin or a bottom spacing between each list item. So for that, we're going to be using gap 2 rems. And let's also add a margin bottom. We'll use margin 004 rems just to create some space between the cities and the actual footer. Now, for the actual list item, we're going to be using flexbox. So display flex. First, we'll start with the horizontal version, right? So we have icon and then the rest of the content. Let's start by setting a gap 1.5 rems to create a space between the icon and the content. Let's change the background color to the just pure white, like so. And let's align the items to the center. Let's add a padding 1.5 rems, should do the trick. Let's change the color of the text. That's going to be shade 80, like that. And let's change the border radius, like so. And we also have a nice box shadow that's responsible for creating this kind of copy of the element. And that box shadow looks something like this. So box shadow, we have 8 pixels, X, 8 pixels, Y, 0 pixels blur, and then it's just white. So we're going to be using RGBA 255, 255, 255, 0.08. And that creates a nice solid shadow behind the element. Great. Let's move on to the city conditions, which is this text here. So city conditions. And here we'll just have to change the color. We're going to be using tint 40, so a lighter color, basically. And then let's just add margin bottom 1 rem just to push that content a little bit further down. So those are the city conditions. Let's go ahead and target city country. And here we'll just change the color to white, and we'll change the background color to our tertiary variable, like so. Let's add the obligatory border radius. That we need a bit of padding inside these elements. So padding 0.125 rems. So that's a very small shadow, and 0.25 rems top and bottom. And finally, let's create some distance between the city name and the country code. So we're going to say margin left 0.5 rems will do the trick nicely. And that's it. These are the cities all styled up. But of course, these will only be displayed like so on smaller screens, right? If we go to a bigger screen, these need to be displayed vertically. So let's quickly create some media queries for that. And we'll start changing these at about 560 pixels, right? So 560 pixels plus, we'll say media, screen, and min width, 560 pixels. We'll do the cities. First of all, we'll target the parent element, and we'll change the number of columns. So we can say grid template columns, for example, 1FR, 1FR, and this will display the elements in 2 columns. Okay, so 2 columns here, but if we make it smaller, let me actually open up the inspector here. It's going to make it a bit easier for us to work. All right, so on smaller screens, where the width is lower than 560 pixels, we are displaying them in 1 column. But then when we get to 560 and above, they get to 2 columns. But what about even larger screens, right? If I make this like full screen, you'll see that these cards are way too big for the content inside. So we need to figure out a different way to display these. Well, thankfully, in CSS Grid, we can do something like this. We can say repeat autofit, And then we do a min-max of, let's say, 12 rems and 1 FR. So what this does, it's basically calculating automatically how many columns we can fit in each or for this layout. Okay, it's a very, very cool functionality of CSS Grid. And here we're basically saying, okay, I want each element to be a minimum of 12 rems. If you can do that, then create a new column. Otherwise, let's default back to 1 FR, which is one fraction of the available space, basically meaning 100% of the available space. Okay, so this is the layout that we're going for. Now, also, when we get to this kind of layout, we need to change the way the city is displayed, right? We need to display it vertically, like so. Thankfully, because we used Flexbox, we can simply change the flex direction. So we can say cities, LI. By default, the flex direction is set to row, but we can set it to column, which will display the items in a vertical fashion. And then all we have to do is say text align center to make sure everything is aligned properly right in the center of the card. And finally, let's target the city conditions. And I'm just going to add a margin bottom 1.5 rems just to push the city and the country code a bit further down. Now, there is another media query that we have to write, and this is actually pretty simple. Notice that on larger screens, we have a bit of a bigger gap from the size of the page. So let's go ahead and make that happen. Simply going to duplicate this one, and this is going to be applied starting with 768 pixels. So when we get to 768, we do the following notification. We say padding 0.5 rems and 4 rems. Let me make this a little bit bigger so you can see the difference. And then finally, we'll target the container and we'll change the padding to 4 rems all around. Okay, so on smaller screens, it looks like this. On bigger screens, it looks like this. And that's it. That's the entire CSS that we need to write for this weather app. All right, so the weather app looks as it should, right? We wrote the CSS. It now looks good, but it doesn't work. It doesn't do anything. So we need to add in that functionality. We need to be able to type a city name and get the relevant weather information for that city using the Open Weather API. Let's go ahead and do that next. As I was saying earlier in this course, we're going to be using the Open Weather API to power up our weather app. Now, Open Weather works just like any other weather information provider. You type in the city name, and this can give you details like the temperature and the conditions, the wind speed, the pressure, humidity, and so on and so forth. Now, to get started with Open Weather, you can go to this link here to create an account and to get your Open Weather API key. You're going to need this to make this work. Personally, I'm going to be using the API key that George used in his written tutorial, but I recommend you get your own. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start writing some JavaScript code. So I'm going to open up the app.js file, and I'm going to start by referencing some DOM elements. So we're going to need a couple. We're going to need the form element. For that, I'm just doing a simple query selector for the search form, like so. And then we're going to need the input. So constant input, that's going to be equal to document query selector, and that's going to be the search term. And here I'm just referencing the IDs that I used in the HTML, right? Search form, search term, and so on and so forth. We also need the message. So constant MSG is going to be document query selector. That's form-msg. And finally, we need a list. That's going to be the list of the cities, right? So we're going to say again, query selector, and here it's just going to be cities. Perfect. Now, let's define the API key. So we're going to say constant API key. That's going to be equal to this one. This is the one George used. And then let's start by adding an event listener for the form submit. So what happens when we type in a value in the input and hit enter, or we click the submit button? So we're going to say form add event listener submit, and here we're just going to say e. This is the event basically. And first thing we'll do is prevent the default behavior, right? So now if I hit enter or I hit submit, nothing happens. Okay. If this wasn't on, whenever I click submit, the form information would be sent to the index.html and the page would be reloaded. We don't want that, so we're preventing the default submission of the form. We'll also hide any message that might be displayed here, and we'll also remove the visible class. So we'll say MSG, sorry, without the comment, so MSG dot text content will be equal to nothing, and then MSG class list remove visible. This is just a reset. Cool. Next, let's get the search value. So we'll create a variable called input val. That's going to be equal to input dot value, right? And the input, we defined it right here. It points to our main input. And next, what we need to do is check if there's already a city that matches the search criteria. So for that, we'll create a new constant called list items array. And that's going to be equal to array dot from list dot query selector all cities li. So let me just make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so what exactly does this mean? Well, list points to the main UL, right? The parent element of the cities. Query selector all cities li basically gets me all the nodes that are inside cities li. And these are put inside of an array by using the array object. So now if we do a console log for list items array and we open up the console, and let me just put this on the bottom. Okay, so if we do the console and we type something in and we submit the form, you can see that we have an array that has these three objects inside. Now, why we're doing this? We're doing it because we want to compare what we just wrote with what we already have. And this basically prevents us from adding the same town. Now, we're going to say if list items array dot length is higher than 0. So if we already have some cities added, then we can start comparing, right? So for that, we'll create a constant called filtered array, and that's going to be equal to list items array dot filter. And here we're going to create a new function that does the following. Create a new variable. We'll call it content. Another one called city name. And that's going to be equal to the element. So the actual city card. Yeah. Dot query selector. And we're going to pass in city name. Dot text content. And we'll also use 2 lowercase. So what we're basically doing here is we're inside the city name variable, we're getting the content of the element with the class of city name, and we're converting it to lowercase. Let's do the same for the city country. So let's actually copy this and paste it. So city country is going to be equal to city country dot text content dot to lowercase. So we're doing the same. We're getting the country code. Now, here's the thing. When we search for a city, we can say the city name like so, but we can also add a comma and then the country code, because there are cities that have the same name but different countries. So when we're doing the name check, we want to check for both formats, for the city only, but also for this format where we also have the country code. So then first, we're going to check for the second format. So we'll say check for the city, comma, country format. And we'll say this: if input val, includes a comma. So if the name we type here has a comma, then we do the following. Just in case the country code is invalid, for example, Athens like so. So this is an invalid format. We just want to keep the first part. Okay. And for that, we say the following: if input val dot split comma, and this will basically give us an array with the first position containing Athens and the second position containing US. So the second part, okay, we say 1. So we're targeting the second element in the array. In case you don't know, elements in an array start at the position 0. So in my case, input val.split, so basically this one gives me an array with 2 positions. Position 0 is Athens, position 1 is US. Okay, so if this dot length is higher than 2, if we have more than 2 characters in here, then this is invalid, right? And in that case, the input val is going to be input val dot split comma 0. Basically, we are updating the input val variable to only contain the first part of what we just wrote. Okay, and here we just get the content from the existing city. So in the content variable, we just say city name, which we're getting from here, sorry. Now, else, if we have a valid format like this, the country code is valid, so we keep both the city and the country. So the content is actually going to be, and we're going to use backticks here. This is actually called a template literal. And because we're using template literals, we can use string interpolation. So we can basically do this. We can say city name and then comma, city, country. So this probably is a little bit confusing to you. So let me try to explain this a different way. If we weren't using template literals, we would have to write the content like this: city name plus a string, comma, plus city country. So to prevent this, because it's not very elegant, we can use this. We're using backticks to start. And whenever we need to insert JavaScript, we just do $, curly braces, and inside here we can put the JavaScript. It can be a lot of things, not just variable names. I can do if statements, I can do whatever. But using template literals like this is a much better way than using the other method that I just showed you. All right, so let's see what we got so far. So we're checking for the city country format, and we're setting or updating the content variable depending on whether or not this is using one format or the other. And what we just wrote here checks for the second format where we have the country code. Now, if we don't have a comma in the name, then we're simply using the single format, like Athens, in which case we're going to set the content to city name. Now, what we need to do here after we did this if else, we can simply return whether or not the existing content matches the form input value. So we can return true or false. So I'm going to return content equals input val to lowercase. And that's it for this first part. Okay, so let's actually do a log of the filtered array, because what we've been doing in this part of the code is simply create an array of filtered items from our original list. That's what filter does, basically. So let's open up the console. Let's search for Athens. Yeah, and Athens actually gives me all three arrays, because all three elements, each and every one of these has the city name of Athens. But if I do Athens US, then we have a blank array, because none of these match the city of Athens from the US. All three are Athens from Greece. But if I were to go back to my HTML and change, for example, the middle one to US, okay, and I do the same thing, then look, I have a search result that points to this middle element. And of course, if I'm typing something else, that doesn't match any existing elements that I might have. Cool. Now, back to the JavaScript. We have the filtered array, okay? And we started this entire journey to check if there's already a city that matches the search criteria. So what happens if we do find a city that matches the search criteria? Well, we simply display a message saying that, hey, you already know the weather for that particular city. So to do that, we can say if filtered array dot length is higher than 0. So if we do have a match, then we set message dot text content will be equal to something like this. So again, we're using backticks, and we're saying you already know the weather for, and then we're inserting filtered array 0, and this basically points to that element in the DOM. And then we're doing query selector city name text content. We're basically pointing to this element right here, or whatever it is that we're matching. Okay. Otherwise, be more specific by providing the country code as well. Okay. So we're changing the contents of the message, and then we need to display the message, right? So we're going to say message class list add visible. So let's try this out. Let's do Athens. Okay. And we get a message saying, hey, you already know the weather for Athens. If I do Athens US, it's going to tell me the same thing. We already know the weather for Athens US. So let's actually do another addition here. After I do a form submission and we display this message, let's reset the form. So form reset, and we'll say input focus, and we will return. So we'll exit the function. So now you can see that when we search for something that is already there, yeah, we show the correct message. If we show for something that's not there, let's say this, yeah, this just makes the message go away and do nothing else, because we haven't found a match for this location. But now it's time to actually add some cities after we search for them. What we did so far was just a quick check to see if there's already a city that matches the search criteria. Now, if there isn't, and at this point we know there isn't because we use the return here, we'll do the following. We'll do some Ajax magic. If you don't know, Ajax stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML, and it basically allows web pages to be updated asynchronously by exchanging data with the web server. So all of this happens without having to refresh the page. Now, to do Ajax requests in JavaScript, there are several ways, but one of the easiest is just to use the fetch API. Okay, so we start by defining a constant called URL, and that's going to point to the weather, the open weather map API. And that looks something like this: https api.openweathermap.org data 2.5 weather, and then we're sending in some data using these parameters. So under Q, we're sending the input value, so whatever we typed here, and we're also sending the app ID as the API key that we defined here, and we're setting the units to metric. Okay, and this is this URL is taken from the official documentation for Open Weather. So then, let's do the actual Ajax request. For that, we say fetch, we pass in the URL, and then we have a couple of responses from this. And I'm just going to write them like this so they're a bit more clear. Then we say response. We're basically converting the response we're getting from the server to a JSON format, and then we're receiving the actual data. So this works in two steps, basically. We make a request to the server gives us a response, and then it actually gives us the actual data that we can work with. So with the data, we can do the following. Let's actually do a console log for data, so you can see exactly what's going on. And I'm going to open up the console here, and I'm going to search for Athens. Okay, and we already know the name. So let's actually go back to index and remove these because we need to generate them from JavaScript either way, like so. And now if I type Athens, now we're getting something back from the server, right? We got an object, and this object has a bunch of information in it. Okay, we have the coordinates for the city, we have the name, we have the country, GR, that stands for Greece, and then inside main, we have the temperature information, humidity, pressure, temp max, temp min, and so on and so forth. So obviously it works. Now, what happens when we search for a city that doesn't exist, like our friend here? So we do this, and we get a 404 not found. We get a 404 code, and the message is city not found. So let's actually work with this first. Okay, and I'm just gonna leave the console log there so we can see it as we're progressing. And I'm gonna say if data.code probably equals to 404, then we can throw a new error, and I'm just gonna send the code and the message. And from my testing, this is actually necessary if we actually want to catch these errors from the Ajax request and display the proper message, right? So I can say .catch, and by the way, this still refers to the fetch that we wrote here. So catch equals, and we're just going to pass in an anonymous function here, and I'm going to say message.textContent is going to be equal to please search for a valid city, and then message class list add visible. Okay, so now if I do another search for this, it's going to display, hey, please search for a valid city. Awesome. So now we covered the situation where we can get an invalid, or when we send an invalid data to the server. But what happens when we send the correct data and we receive the information, the weather information about that particular city? Well, we need to start creating a city card for it. So let's go ahead and do that right now. First of all, this is a big object, right? The one that we received here. It has a bunch of information in it. And for the purpose of this demo, we only need a couple of information. So we're going to do something called destructuring a data object. So we're going to define a constant, and we're going to say this: main name sys and weather, and that's going to be equal to data. What this is doing, it's basically parsing the data object that we received, and it's just deconstructing it into separate constants. So now we have a constant main, or a main object, a name object, a sys object, and a weather object that have the exact contents of the main, sys, name, and weather objects from my initial response. Okay, so now if I do a console log for, I don't know, weather, let's say if I can type weather, and I remove this old console log, and I search for Athens, yeah, this basically gives me an array with just the information about the weather, as you can see here. So that's what destructuring the data object is doing. So now that we have all of this information in separate constants, let's start by defining the icon location. So we're going to create an icon, or a constant called icon, and that's going to be equal to img dash weather dash, and you'll see that I have a bunch of different names here for the SVGs, and these names are actually mandatory because these are codes that are generated by the Open Weather API. If we look here in the response, we can see that the icon for the city when it comes to weather is 01D, and this is the code for clear sky. If I search for another city, let's say Bucharest, that's going to give me actually the same thing because it's apparently clear. But let's search for Anchorage, let's say. So Anchorage, which is in Alaska, I believe. Okay, this one has a different weather condition. It's misty. And the code for the icon is different. It's 50N. Okay, so the icons that that you'll see in each city card will be displayed based on this code provided by Open Weather. So in here, we need to actually target this value. So how do we do that? Well, let's do the following. We say weather. This is an array, by the way. So we can say weather 0, and then we can grab the icon, and we can say .svg, like so. So that's the icon defined. Next, let's create the list item for the new city. So we'll say constant li equals document, create element. We're going to create a list item. Next, let's define the markup. So const markup will be equal to, again, backticks to make it easier for us to write the markup. And we'll write the exact markup that we had in the HTML. And that looks something like this. And I'm just going to do a bit of cleanup here. So let me walk you through this. So we start again with the figure, just like we did in the markup stage. We define an image. The source, we pass in the icon that we just defined. The alt, we're passing in the weather description that we got from our data. And then for the H2, we're doing a math round main temp because by default, the temperature comes with 2 digits. So we just want an integer basically. And then we get the paragraph, city conditions, we're just displaying the description to uppercase, and then the city name inside the first span and the city country inside the second span. So that's the markup. Basically, it's exactly the same markup we used in the first lesson. We just replaced those hard-coded names with these embedded expressions. So now that the markup is created, we're going to do this list item, which is the element that we just created, inner HTML equals to markup. And now let's add this to the page. So we're going to say list append child list item, and that's it. Now if we click on anchorage and we hit add, the scripts or the script that we wrote creates a new element with the correct icon, with the temperature, with the description, and also with the correct city name and country code. We can add Athens, and that's going to be Athens from Greece, or we can grab the Athens from US, and that's going to create a new element. And it's all happening seamlessly. Because we used CSS Grid, these items are just added one after the other. And of course, if I type something that doesn't make sense, it's just going to tell me, please search for a valid city. And I can add as many cities as I want. And of course, it would be nice to clear this information from the input right after I add a new city. So what we can do is go down here and say message text content equals to none. And let's reset the form and let's focus the input. So input.focus. Save that. So now we can search for a city. That's going to be cleared. We can search for another, and another, and another, and so on and so forth. And that's how you can create a weather app with vanilla JavaScript and the Open Weather API. That's about it for this course. I hope you found it useful, and if you have any questions, please leave a comment down below. As always, don't forget to check out the Envato Tuts Plus YouTube channel for more content like this, but also to learn about web design, web development, and much more. It's all free, so make sure to also hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. I'm Adi, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care.